What's good, creators? Welcome back to Monzon Media. Great to have you back. Today is part 3 of our exposure triangle series, and we're going to cover ISO today. Now, many people, including myself, have pronounced this as ISO. And I've learned not too long ago the actual proper way to pronounce it is ISO. And what ISO is the sensitivity of the camera sensor. And very simply, the higher the ISO number, the more brighter your image is, and the lower it is, the darker the image can be. However, there is a trade-off with increasing your ISO. The more you increase that number, the more you're prone to introduce artifacting or grain in your images or video. So the general rule of thumb is to keep your ISO as low as possible. Most cameras' standard base ISO is 100 or 200 ISO, and that's where you would get the best dynamic range, the best quality. But as you go higher in those numbers, you start to introduce artifacting or introduce grain, and especially in those low light situations. So let's backtrack on how you adjust ISO. And simply, if you go into your camera here, and you're going to see at the bottom right, you'll see ISO 100. Now, if I were to increase that to, let's say, 500, you're going to see how bright that scene changes because we're artificially adding fictitious light. Now, if you look at the settings, the shutter speed is at 1/80th of a second, aperture is at f1.8, and ISO 100. This is the ideal setting for this particular scene with the lighting I have and all that stuff. So it works very well. Now, sometimes you may not have the proper lighting in your scene, and you have to artificially replicate that by changing the settings in your camera. So I'm going to switch off these lights. The image now is much darker because there is no light to compensate for the lack of it. So as a general rule, as we said, you want to keep your ISO as low as possible, and you want to manipulate first your shutter speed or your aperture to get that available light first. But as you can see with this scene, I'm maxed out on my aperture. I am using the 50mm 1.8. This is the biggest aperture available that I can use. So my other option is shutter speed. Now, if I change the shutter speed, currently it's at 1/80th of a second, I could probably lower this to 1/50th to get a little bit more light, or even lower because I'm on a tripod at 1/25th of a second. If you're hand holding this, that shutter speed might be too low, and even the slightest shake you have in your hand, your image might come out blurry. So I'm going to play it safe and keep it at 1/50th of a second. According to my meter, I'm severely underexposed. So my only option now is to use ISO. So as I increase this ISO, let's try 320. And we're going to see by my meter that it is properly exposed because the cursor's in the middle. So now I've set the white balance to automatic, and it gives it a little bit of yellowish, makes it a bit warmer. So even at ISO 320, it still has very minimal grain and artifacting, at least for the Canon M50. But let me give you a scenario where, let's say I wanted the background to be more in focus. So how I can do that is increasing the aperture. So let's say I wanted to shoot at f6.3 so I can get more of the background. But you see what happens is that at 6.3, I'm losing light now because I'm stopping down the aperture to get more in focus. Now, if you're wondering what aperture is, make sure you check out the first video of this series where we talk about aperture. And as mentioned before, I don't want to adjust my shutter speed so low where it may introduce motion blur with the slightest movement. So again, all I have is ISO to increase. As I increase ISO, let's try it at 800. It's still fairly underexposed. Now I'm going to go all the way to 2000 here, and it's still a little bit underexposed. So we're going to adjust it to 3200 now. So in this example, as you see, we're now at ISO 3200, and more of the background is in focus because we've increased the aperture to 6.3, but you do see a slight decrease in quality because we've been raising the ISO higher than what the M50 can handle. Now you can fix this in post and get rid of some of the grain, but it's typically not ideal. Now in this example, I'm going to show you the same settings with my Sony A7C, and the same focal length is going to be somewhat a little bit different. I'm going to use the same settings as the M50, but you're going to see that the noise is less noticeable on the Sony A7C, mainly because it's a full frame camera, and of course it costs more money, but it does handle noise a lot better compared to the Canon M50. One of the reasons why people like fast glass or prime lenses that can shoot at an aperture of 1.8, 1.4 or lower is because they can bring out more light through the lens instead of increasing the ISO, because there's always that trade-off of quality. So therefore you're going to have to increase your ISO to compensate and further degrading that image. And then secondly is using lighting. Again, flash photography, whether you have strobes or continuous lighting. So as in the example we just looked at, now that I have lighting, I can bring my ISO back down to 100. Now in this situation, if I wanted to keep my aperture at 6.3, I can bring my ISO back down to 800. White balance is off, so I'm going to adjust that. So even at ISO 800, this is a way better image, because now I'm using a softbox to help with keeping that ISO low. And then of course I can further compensate by using a bigger aperture number, therefore allowing me to use a lower ISO number. So as you see here, we are back at ISO 100, and I can bring my shutter speed to 80 just to even out that exposure, resulting in a cleaner image, no grain, less artifacting, and you would be a happy photographer. So this concludes the basics on aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. And in the final video coming in a few days, we're going to put it all together, and I'm going to give you certain scenarios and what settings that you could play around with to put this all together and start getting control of your camera. Now be sure to hit that notification bell and subscribe button so you know when that video goes live. As always, I'm so appreciative of all of you guys joining the community, and yeah, I'm excited for the videos that are coming out very soon. Now until the next video, get out there, hit record, and create.